The New Horizon, journeying towards America, starts turning around in a large arc. The ship was now heading back in the direction it had just come. The crew ran in all directions when they discovered the not so subtle deviation off course. Some anxious, others panicked, because no one could deny that the ship was no longer following the sun, but rather positioning itself to head back into it. Is there any more simpler way of saying that the ship is no longer headed west, but now turning again to the east? We don't want Russia, we want America. The hidden thoughts and lack of communication on the ship allowed the crew to answer their own questions in any way they wanted. Was their mission over? Were they being recalled? Anger then set in, because they had to cruise the Atlantic along the African continent for a good part of the year, developing a legitimacy, so that when the precise time arrived to carry out their mission, it would be successful. This loss of clarity on the crew's part lasted only until they heard screams emanating from the bridge. And as if they were the worst criminals in the world, young members of the bridge crew were being cast out the doors, and in most cases the crew members affected gladly partook. They didn't go far, though, because the ship's navigational problem was still taking place within the bridge area. The commander, Alexander Romanov, though having had to retrieve the helm, could not manage to reverse the process. And this senior officer knew at that point his mission was in jeopardy, because he literally lost control of his ship. So he painstakingly started going through every safety procedure on hand to find any prior reference to uncontrollable steering difficulty experienced in the past, but to no avail. At this point, though, he looked begrudgingly at the elaborate computer systems scattered around the bridge that are responsible for the navigation on his ship, and he knew that any problems whatsoever with the steering had to come from one of the programs installed. So he started turning off computer systems that he wasn't really sure of their function. But it was safer than having his ship controlled by individuals unknown. And in this case, he was highly suspect of his submerged shadow currently following closely in his wake. His intention was to eliminate computer-run programs in favor of functions that could be manually run. Older engineers were brought in to the bridge to take the place of or help the younger seamen with limited training outside the computer field to get the ship back on course. But even with the experienced seamen on the bridge, the ship still did not respond to his commands. He finally had to take the word of his computer specialist that these programs believed to be affected were beyond reproach, and the ship's electronic warfare capability might deflect any further intrusions. Unfortunately for them and their secrecy, even activating the warfare systems would alert the world to their intentions. So his decision was simple. The ship is to maintain its own fixed course until the moment the crew can regain control. Members of the crew still on the bridge are looking at their captain for leadership, but all they can see is a blank face, showing no emotion, because this is not the first time he has had to face despair. The first time coming when his leaders ordered his country's military might to retreat out of Afghanistan in the 1980s. He might have been young then, but he still felt the shame of failure. Luckily, the American politicians made the case that the evil empire the Soviet Union was bankrupt, and him and his countrymen laughed because at the moment they had been literally outfought, and their opposition included a full-fledged mujahideen of fighters with American advisors. So the arrogant Americans helped them recoup their honor after a devastating loss, ensuring that their reputations were secure because the lack of money beat them in Afghanistan, not another soldier. How ironic that the people America helped to drive out the Soviet forces from Afghanistan are now fighting against a coalition of Middle Eastern countries with America at the vanguard to expel foreign invaders in their nations such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Are the Americans going to use the excuse they lost these wars because it became a matter of money? Does an evil empire, such as President Reagan suggested the USSR was, need money? Or can they just take the food off of their own people's tables? This captain's idea to allow the ship's controls to work out their own irregularities might seem peculiar, but for the moment it is the only option they have, and though it might not be the best option, the only thing they have to lose is time. And this time can be made up once full control has been returned to the bridge. Meanwhile, in his log, Captain Romanoff will write that the ship's computer system was to blame, but fortunately for them, the missiles hidden below deck have independent hard drives, and the missile casings are designed to deflect any EMP, electromagnetic pulse attacks, which would also eliminate all electronic jamming threats. These missiles are special, not like other Russian military stock, because they were configured with not only ballistic capability, but also incorporated pillow and cruise technologies. While you watch the sleight of the hand, the missiles will strike. The weakness of a ballistic missile is that it goes up, reaching its trajectory, and comes down. If you use enough missiles, success is achievable. But in the case of this ship and its limited cargo, success is not guaranteed, because the missiles can be detected and neutralized long before they reach the shore. So for the success of this mission to take place, it will require this ship arriving closer to America's shore. But for some unknown reason, we are heading away from success in a different direction. Plans, though, are not guarantees, because they have good results as well as bad results. But in this case, one of the missiles below deck has activated. And location is not on the ship's site either, because they were too far from the American continent to make a difference. Even if the one missile exploded, it would not cause a reaction to the other missiles still dormant. But the time before detonation suddenly turned from hours, minutes, and seconds to a far more complex numerical system that appeared to decrease every nautical mile they traveled. But the numbers decreased only when they were headed towards their homeland of Russia. The engineers tried desperately to slow the vessel down, hoping that the number on the gauge would also slow. But that was not the case, because for every nautical mile below the desired speed of 14 nautical miles per hour, the gauge would double the number of nautical miles reduced. Someone had the idea that they could then reduce the miles traveled an hour enough so the detonation could take place far from the European continent and Russia. Unfortunately, as they neared the detonation period, the gauge reset itself again to the amount of time necessary to reach Russia, and again control of the bridge was taken away from the crew. And what would happen if they simply stopped? But at that moment, bursts of automatic rifle fire are heard from many different positions aft on the ship. And the captain, as well as every other senior member of his crew, runs to discover the reason behind the lethal commotion. The senior enlisted member, though, a big man, Damian Antropov, that called the nation of Moldava his home, was the first to arrive, and he started throwing younger men to the right and left as he removed the AK-47s from their grasp. It was hard to imagine their purpose when he discovered them shooting bursts of military fire into their own ship's wake to harm a solid piece of metal called the submarine that had been following them in the deep. And even though no one could see the submarine from the deck, they accused it and its crew of redirecting their ship away from its target. Captain Romanov didn't even need to make his presence known, because the senior man explained to the offenders now resting on the deck, licking their wounds, that even if these weapons could have caused damage to the submersible, it could also have provoked the sub to retaliate, and that by itself might have set off the stockpile of nuclear weapons on this ship. Letting off steam is one thing, but don't do it in a manner that will also doom themselves.